this is a body of work that kind of speaks to all of you in some way. And the last part of my bio, the Howarth Wright Fellowship, paid for the first part of this work, and in some ways I'm going to spend a lot of time giving you background information, because for me this exploration of digital technology is rooted in a historical architectural practice, namely a sort of subset of Frank Lloyd Wright's work. I would like to thank Nick Bradley for introducing me to Gentry, and he's actually in the background in one of the slides because he was there when the photo was taken in 2008, I think. So welcome and thank you. I come to you from the University of California, Irvine, and from my gallery in Toronto, Barry Nadimi Gallery. I am going to do some brief sales pitches, particularly to those of you interested in graduate school. We have an MFA program in electronic art design. We also have a general MFA program. My main pitch to those of you in art is it's free, which is somewhat rare. So we have a 3-year funded MFA program for 10 students a year. And applications are due January 15th. I come into the art department as a designer, which is a somewhat unusual thing, despite the proximity of art and design, particularly those of you outside of creative practice. But and so I'm organizing a conference on Friday. If you happen to want to come with me on the plane, we have a conference about these questions of design. But the way we approach design at UCI is not in a professional sense. It's about the kinds of questions design asks, and for me, kind of how to connect that to the similar questions that art asks of the world. But I was an architect once, and very quickly abandoned doing things like this because it's boring and tends to get canceled. And began a kind of critical practice, or what we call a critical practice, which frankly is any form of architecture that doesn't involve making a building, gets lumped under this title. And in my case, it was photographic. This is a project I'm also working on right now, focused on this building. This is the tallest building north of the 60th parallel in Canada. It's in Hay River, Northwest Territories. And I've been going to Hay River every year now with a mixed group of anthropologists and artists to try to kind of understand this building in its landscape. So what is it telling us, and what can we say about it? And what we've decided to say is we're going to represent back to the world what this building sees. Because it's so dominant in its landscape, we'd like to kind of erase it by making an installation that shows what the building can see around itself over a 12-month period. And this is kind of my segue into the digital technology part. I mean, ultimately this boils down to a technical problem of trying to keep 4 cameras alive, taking photos every 30 seconds for 12 months, and then dealing with all of that information and figuring out how to kind of present it back in a way that is effective and effective. So that'll happen, I think, next year if the cameras don't get hit by lightning some more. And I actually put these slides in for Kate because I wanted to show her what we were doing in another project. But this is a kind of example of what the landscape is like and what this building kind of bears witness to. And obviously some of these things are just obvious. It's cold and very far north. Also the kinds of patterns of occupation in this town over the course of 12 months are varied. And then there's these kinds of problems, which are fun and interesting to try to solve. It does fix itself in a second. The nice thing about Hay River as a site is that the building bears witness not only to this kind of industrial landscape and a colonized landscape, but also a First Nation space across the river. This is the Hay River itself, and on the other side of the river is a local. It's not, strictly speaking, a reserve, but it's a kind of First Nations community. And in the winter, you can drive there directly, but in the summer, you have to drive 40 kilometers around the river to get there. And so there's this very kind of this set of relationships between those two communities that changes throughout the year. And when the river, what we anticipate is the river breaking up, and it'll be a kind of dramatic moment to watch the whole kind of ice of the river move down into this Great Slave Lake at some point in April or May. But that is not what I'm here to talk to you about today. I'm going to give you the trajectory of a body of work that starts in architecture and kind of ends in a practice that is expressing what we see on the computer as an object. And I'm going to cheat and not show you that right away, and spend 2 more minutes talking about other things that I do. This was my last exhibition, and again about architecture, in this case a similar building type to the Hay River building, but located in Toronto, a very common kind of residential type. And the technological interest here is that while this scene, as depicted, is true, it doesn't actually happen all at once. I mean, photography historically has is interested in a moment in time that's very specific. This image was taken over the course of an hour and a half and kind of cobbled together, and so the boy in the foreground does happen at some point, but not necessarily at the same point as this window or this light. And this has led to, and so I show this because my small number of Instagram friends kind of watch me and see that the boys actually do lots of things, and there's a kind of critical choice here about how many people should I include in the scene and what kind of best represents the landscape as I experience it. And what I'm really enjoying about this way of working as a photographer is it sort of it asks all the questions photography asked originally, like in the 1850s. What are we doing when we make images, and what are we able to do, and what are the kind of meanings associated with all the things we're able to do. And so we're in a moment photographically when technology has really kind of deconstructed photography and brought it back to its roots, and we have all of these choices of how to work because of digital technology. This is another image from that series, and again, kind of, we don't all have this foreground element, but the deer in the foreground become a kind of compositional choice. They eventually ran away because I bothered them, so there's a kind of relationship between literally taking the image and what happens in the landscape, but I was lucky enough to be able to grab them and include them in the information at some point. All of which leads me to this very basic question, which is, what is the deal with pixels, this thing that we construct images with today, that how many of you have taken digital photos? This is kind of like a single one. So, and how many of you know what a pixel is? Which is interesting because historically when you used film photography, you might not have been familiar with how film photography worked. That wasn't such a common knowledge set among people who took film photography, really had no idea what was happening. But we're sort of familiar with this notion of pixels, of subdividing space into squares that carry color and tone. It's a very unnatural, to use a dangerous word, kind of construction. If you zoom in this far in nature, you get things like this in trees and this in rocks. It doesn't reduce to a Cartesian grid. Even film photography, if you zoom in far enough, you're getting kind of clumps of silver that are attracted to light, and it's non-linear in nature the farther in you zoom. So it's a kind of basic question, but an interesting one. Why do we want to do this thing? Well, because we need this thing. We need to reduce everything to binary sequences that computers can understand, and so we come up with a series of strategies in all media that allow the computer to sort of engage with and process information. And the pixels that kind of, you can carry the value in one number and the tone in another number, and it's easy for the computer to do that. But where does this idea come from of subdividing space into a grid? Descartes invented Cartesian space, and again, so I'm going to do some of you this will be like high school math, and maybe for others it'll be, high school math. Don't remember that stuff. But Descartes came up with Cartesian space in the 17th century, and then we've all seen this at some point in our lives. It took until, this is the 19th century, for somebody to have the brilliant idea of taking Descartes' space and applying it to the land. The Louisiana Purchase was subdivided into these multi-acre plots by Thomas Jefferson, just by decree, like, I'm going to take all of the United States and divide it into these areas. And we see the vestiges of that in the Midwest. This is like flying over Iowa. You get the perfect grid in the landscape. And this is very different from most other places. Like in Europe, when land was divided historically, it was divided in kind of organically along the river. There are various schemes for subdividing space, but this idea of just taking a mathematical space and overlaying it on the land is a very new and modern kind of way of thinking, relative to our culture. In the early 20th century, somebody had the even more crazy idea of, why don't we take this space and assign everybody a piece of it? And so each human, as a kind of notion, is each family is assigned an acre. And it's like, well, we can't do that. There's not enough space in America to give every person an acre. Well, it turns out there is. If you took every person in America or North America, actually, if you added Canada to this, it would be even easier. If you took but to stick in America, you would fit in the size of Texas. So you would actually have a tremendous open space, even if you gave every single person an acre, which for me really reminds me of just how vast the landscape actually is. I mean, we actually have tons and tons of space. We didn't do this, of course, for all sorts of other reasons, like cars and traffic, and why would you want to live so far from all your neighbors? But Frank Lloyd Wright, who was the author of the Broadacre City scheme, was very kind of fixated on these grid-like formations and how he could subdivide space with a grid. Frank Lloyd Wright is a figure, a kind of figure in the creative world that he lived for so long and did so many things, so he's important to so many different aspects of creativity. I mean, he's an architect, but he also, he lived in the Victorian age and in the modern age, and produced ideas throughout all of those times. And he lied about his age so that when he was in his 90s, he was actually 96. He didn't want people to know how old he was, so he pretended to be only 90, and kind of suppressed his birthday. He wasn't able to execute Broadacre City, but what he did instead was, in a series of residences known as the Usonian homes, took this grid-like idea to a fair extreme. In all 3 dimensions, sort of laid a perfect cubic grid onto the space and organized it this way, which sounds, architects basically do this these days by rote, but it's kind of an extreme idea. Like, why do we want to live in space that's organized in this very perfect cubic way? And Wright's fixation on Platonic geometry was extreme. He would do this with circles and triangles. He was also the kind of person who would insist on making sure all the screws were perfectly horizontal, and would come and inspect the house. So this is what the wall section of a Usonian house looks like, and in the interior you see the kind of grid on the floor, and if you were to draw a series of lines in every direction, everything would fit perfectly in a perfect cubic grid of space. Later, wood got too expensive, so he proposed yet another series about 20 years further on. The same idea, but in concrete, and these are known collectively as the Usonian automatic homes. And they look like this, and the grid is even more present. It's so glaringly visible everywhere. It's a 2-foot by 1-foot unit, but you can see it in the walls and in the floors. It's kind of impressive, actually, and it's a fascinating idea. It's a terrible way to make a building. There's 12 of these in the U.S. He intended for there to be thousands and thousands of them. And the entire house is made up of 12 different pieces. So if you want to make an addition, you just make more of the 12 pieces, and you can add on to your house, in theory. With the Howarth Wright funding, a collaborator and I, Lou Stern, so I'd like to acknowledge Lou Stern, who's an architect in Vancouver, who I work with on 95% of what I'm showing today. We visited all of the Usonian sites we could, and became particularly interested in the Usonian automatic set because it seemed like such a pure expression of this idea of subdividing space from a cubic grid, as well as having these ideological sort of fixations like, you're going to build a house yourself. This became an interesting element. I mean, it was a very, it had a lot of interesting elements, which I'll elaborate on in a second. These houses start earlier in Wright's work. The house I just showed you is the Tompkins residence from 1955. This is the Ennis house from 1922, which is mostly known because it's a Deck's house in Blade Runner. If you haven't, anyone seen Blade Runner? This is like almost before I was born, kind of film, but excellent future, forward-looking film, very William Gibson in spirit, and so Deck lives in the Ennis residence, and you sit to see the bricks in the background. This is another house from this era. This is the Millard residence, actually, in Pasadena. And again, it's just, I show this slide because it's almost the purest expression. Everything is a square. We've got a 2-foot grid here, a 1-foot grid here, and if you were to draw a cubic grid across this volume, everything would intersect perfectly with that, just like the way pixels do in image. And I'll introduce a word at this juncture. The 3-dimensional equivalent of a pixel is a voxel. So a volumetric pixel is a cube of space, and how we choose to process that, or in this case, we're processing it by adding a certain type of cubic unit into the space to make a building. But we can also do this, as we'll see later, in the computer in a very particular way. So going back to the Usonian automatics, by the 50s they've become much simpler. They're not as ornamented, and Wright provides plans for each of the different units required to build the house. This is what one looks like in a little bit more detail. This is the Tracy residence from 1955 as well. And Nick and I had the good fortune of going to visit Mrs. Tracy, who lived there until 2012. This was in 2008. And Mrs. Tracy at the time was her husband had passed away fairly recently. She lived in the house since 1955. And the one story she could tell over and over, very perfectly was the story of the house. She actually couldn't answer questions about her life in it, about anything else, but because she'd given the tour of her own house so many times, and she was very lucid about how her and her partner had in 1955 for 2 years, or from 53 to 55, made all of these units, the roof, the walls, everything you see, they sort of cast themselves in their backyard. This is south of Seattle. Unfortunately, Mrs. Tracy has passed away, and the house has now been purchased by a collector who plans to restore it. But the amazing thing for me as an architect, or at the time was more of an architect, I suppose, was the level of attachment by building their own house. I mean, Mrs. Tracy never wanted to leave. It made sense. And that was true of most of the owners of these homes, because they had invested their own energy in making it. There was just no question of ever moving away from them. And so it's less of a kind of commodity item. So we thought, well, if Mr. and Mrs. Tracy can build one of these things, why don't we build one too, Luke and I? So we looked at the plans. We're like, what's the smallest possible unit to represent the entire Usonia automatic project? And we determined that something that was 3 units by 5 units, all of these in pink, are what you could make in a 3 by 5 area with the Usonian automatic system. These are the units required to build a house, and these are Wright's plans for how to make the casting apparatus or the formwork required to build the house. And they look, well, they're really clear, so we'll just follow them, and we can reverse engineer this process. And so we made this rather crude box, and that's what we got. Because it turns out that Wright made these drawings, but he never made any of these houses. And so contractors and interpreters basically figured out how to make the units themselves. At this point in his career, Wright's famous enough that if he designs something, someone's going to make it. And so this is not how this block is actually made, despite... the worst thing is Wright doesn't draw these drawings. He has apprentices that draw the drawings. And so he sort of stands there. Wright is also the origin of the slave intern model of life. So we can trace that back to Wright as well, and a few other people. We did eventually figure out how to make these things, and proceeded to build enough units to make an installation in 2009, and this is what it looks like installed. And so we haven't gotten to any digital making yet. This is all analog making, in fact, deliberately analog. We made sure we only used the tools available to the Tracys in 1955 to build the casting work and to make the units. But we wanted to sort of showcase what is this minimum set of minimum assembly that represents the idea. And one of the things that we found the most compelling was the formwork itself is this kind of beautiful unfolded space. This represents the idea more completely in a way than the finished pieces, because you can go on and make more of them and any number of them with these casting units. And if anybody wants to acquire a 20,000-pound installation and have it all in storage in Toronto, and ship it to you at great expense. So I have a blank slide here to remind me that this is a pause between 2 projects, and so Luke and I have done this undertaking, and it's been very rewarding, sort of recreating the Bill and Elizabeth Tracy experience with the Usonian automatic system by making it ourselves. We wanted to come up with an equivalent contemporary idea, and weren't sure where to find it. So I often use this slide in presentations to students where I'm like, when you're designing something or when you're creating something, you have to take these leaps of faith from one thing to another, because it's not a kind of linear process trying to decide what to do. And we recognized, of course, that there is this other, actually Lego, interestingly, comes from the 50s as well. And nowadays we have these Frank Lloyd Wright Lego sets. And there's a clear relationship here, these stacked units to make a building. But the thing that's boring about Lego is that it only goes one direction. You can only, just like a cinder block, you can only stack the units. And that sort of imposes a limitation on how you can attach 3-dimensional space. Wouldn't it be cool if you could, in fact, make cinder blocks or Legos that click together on 6 sides, as demonstrated by this illustration? I mean, of course, these Legos don't work. There's just a basic mechanical problem. How do you actually connect them? The second problem that in this contemporary interpretation, so we're moving towards, like, we'd like to do a contemporary interpretation of units that make a building, and I think more kind of abstractly, units that make space. And we don't want there to be too many units. We don't want to be one of those Lego sets that is like the Star Wars Lego where there's all these unique pieces. We want it to be old school Lego where there's only 50 pieces maximum. Otherwise, you're just going to use a cinder block because it's just annoying to have too many unique pieces. And the pixel, the idea of the pixel, I think because we were of a generation of creative artists and designers that are so deeply informed by digitalia of all kinds, is kind of hovering in the back of our minds. And Luke remembered from computer science, from either third or fourth year modeling I'm learning, is where you would learn a series of algorithms that are used to subdivide space and volume so that the computer can process those things and manipulate them. This is called the marching squares algorithm. And what it does is it takes any arbitrary blob and it turns it into a simpler blob. It's a very crude form of pixelation where the simplification results in all 45 and 90-degree angles. The way it works is if you take a unit of space, sort of one pixel area, and you divide it into quadrants, and you intersect any arbitrary area with that unit of space, you get a certain simplification. So there's 4 quadrants, so because this is passing through only one of the quadrants, we get a simplification that looks like that. And if you run this algorithm across all possible intersections of this cube, of this square of space, and a piece of the blob, like so, here's for 1 quadrant, 2 quadrants, 3 quadrants, all quadrants, and then opposing quadrants, you get the following pieces. And these puzzle pieces can be assembled to make any object. In the case of marching squares, you only actually need these 6 pieces to make anything. And again, it's this very kind of crude, it's one step better than just having, just reducing things to squares. Now you've got squares with 45s. And so it's a bit smoother as a simulation than a purely pixelated simulation, which is how our camera takes advantage of the massive processing power of today's computers to make the pixels so small that we can't see them. But if you don't have that processing power and you need the grid to be larger, then you might want a way of subdividing an area that's a bit smoother. This has a 3-dimensional equivalent called marching cubes, and I'm going to show it to you graphically. It follows the same logic, which is you calculate all possible intersections of a segment of a volume with a voxel space, and the voxel space is divided into 8 quadrants in this case. And if you calculate all of those, this is the first possible intersection. If you sort of process all possible intersections, you get more pieces. So this would be, where it passes through the middle, and here it's kind of passing through it on 2 sides. And just like in the 2-dimensional equivalent, the leap into the unknown here is that for computer graphics, this is all you need. You just need that surface, because a computer screen is only showing you a surface. The purpose of this algorithm, I should add, is to represent volumetric space, but in terms of surfaces. When you spin something around in a computer, and if you play any games where like a 3-dimensional object rotates, the computer needs to be able to show that to you in a certain way, and it uses algorithms like this or subsequent algorithms that are more sophisticated to render that to you. It's literally called the rendering mesh of that object. In physical space, we need to make one further step, which is to interpret it as a volume as either one side of the cube or the other side of the cube. And it turns out if you take all of the pieces that are here, like there's some common pieces, but if you collect all of the unique pieces, you end up with a kit of parts that can equally be used to create any volumetric space in a way that's very similar to Wright's system. So in the automatic system, you've got these kind of casting apparatus that makes 11 unique components. In the case of marching cubes, what you have is you've got a reciprocal relationship between the positive side and the negative side, which translates into the same relationship between a kind of casting apparatus and something made of, in this case, concrete. And we're interested in concrete at this point because we've just made an installation of concrete, so what better thing to do than make another heavy, massive installation that you have to then store for many years. And that was the next body of work, or the next sort of subset of this body of work, which was Automatic Revisited. And in this case, we made it, we were able to invest in contemporary tools, some of which are actually quite old, like the CNC machine, in order to kind of sort of create the units. And I have my indulgent making video here. But because I know that some of you are very interested in making, and because Gentry is for those of you working with Gentry, it's this question of what the humanities can do with making, and what questions and what ways of exploring the question of making. I'm not going to try to explain DH because this is not what I do, but I think it's important to me to sort of show the making. And in some practices, some artists are not invested in making. They create, in fact, they almost suppress the means of production. But this was very much an artisanal product made by Luke and I and anybody we could convince to help us over the course of 3 weeks. And several cameras died in this documentary. But basically, we had a kind of casting tray, and we would fill the tray with the one side of the Merchant Cubes unit, and it would then create the other side. The white concrete is a lightweight form of concrete. It uses aerated glass instead of rock. The aerated glass also makes it possible to put the concrete on a milling machine in order to make sure the surfaces are perfectly square. And eventually, when the video gets here, drill holes in it so that all of the units can be attached. Because in both Wright's system and our system, there's this hidden mechanism for attaching all the units. In the case of Wright's system, there's rebar that sits between each of those pieces, and then they pour grout between. It's kind of like tile, but the grout is hidden and it's inside. We wanted, in order to be able to make something that was three-dimensional, it could go both attached upwards and sideways, we needed to install steel hardware that connected the pieces in all three axes, which happens very soon. There we go. That's the most painful part, is the 3 seconds in which people actually look at it. So this is what it looked like, and I'll fully concede that, at 6 years distance, we meant to fill this hole, but we ran out of time. And so this is also meant to be a kind of minimum set that suggests how, if you had hundreds of these, you could build architectural space. And these drawings in the background sort of show various architectural spaces made of a 10 by 10 by 10 unit volume. Intersections of floors and ceilings and vertical and horizontal surfaces, because architecture basically consists of vertical and horizontal surfaces, and if you're getting really crazy, kind of tilted and curved surfaces. How this would have worked as architecture was if you wanted a swoopy shape, as many architects tend to, if you're willing to accept that the shape can be simplified into a faceted surface. And any of you who are invested in 3D printing at all, you go through a step where you create a tessellated mesh. And the tessellated mesh is the form of three-dimensional object that the 3D printer understands. And that's a very similar volume in computer in the virtual space that is a kind of simplification of what you originally made. It's a more sophisticated algorithm, but it creates far more unique pieces. In fact, made of triangles, thousands and thousands of triangles. And one of the ways we measure the density of that object is how many triangles does it have? Does it have 10,000 or 100,000 triangles? This would only have 12 kind of triangles or squares that make its surface. And as a volumetric, as an object, out of concrete, this is what it looks like. And as a building, you would then go on to do all the things buildings do. You'd cover it in insulation, and you'd add other materials to the face, and maybe you'd even recapture that original swoopy surface as a kind of outer structure. And this is fairly representative of how contemporary architecture is assembled today. And well, why do you want this? Well, we've got lots of people who want this sort of swoopy surface. And in fact, in the back, this is a Frank Gehry building. In the back of a Frank Gehry building, you'll see this elaborate superstructure that is the thing that the metal surface is attached to. The difference with our system is that this superstructure is not made of unique parts. And I could go on, but let me just say this doesn't become architecture. The reason is that in order to attach a mere 12 unique parts, this is the amount of hardware required. And this amount of hardware, so this is a volume about this big, and there's thousands and thousands of pieces of hardware. And it's just not a great way to make a building. So this caused us to reflect on Wright's practice, which also wasn't a great way to make a building. In fact, both of these projects, to me, represent less a kind of viable form of architecture and more a manic desire to systematize and subdivide and create modules that then go on to create. It's a very kind of maniacal or monomaniacal idea. Like, I'm going to create the master module that everything is made out of, and I'm going to then lay those things over the whole world. And Wright was very much in this. I mean, he was an exceptionally arrogant and egotistical person, according to, so I hear. And the toys kind of also registered in the back of my mind. And then I, got a different job and worked on some other projects. And this was in 2009. In 2012, I got a MakerBot. and thought, oh, I've got all these three-dimensional models of these little units. Why don't I just start making them? And then I got distracted, and I curated a show about 3D printed objects. So that became a kind of curatorial. A curatorial project emerged from the acquisition of my own 3D printer. I had used 3D printers previously in graduate school. I was sort of lucky enough to be a somewhat early adopter of that technology, but consumer-grade 3D printers hadn't arrived. And this opens up a whole new possibility for artisans of all types. This is a sort of set of objects that were curated in the show. A lot of them are jewelry, because I was co-curating this with a jeweler. In fact, this is Greg Sims' work, the co-curator of the exhibition. Some of the jewelry was sort of explicitly mathematical. This is a mathematician slash jeweler from Australia who takes Hilbert space, in this case. I don't know what Hilbert space is, but maybe some of you do, and turns it into a bracelet. These are some other examples of sculptural work. This is a colleague of mine who makes anatomically correct fetuses for the purpose of surgical training. But as a kind of art object, they're very wonderful and scary. And their names are things like, fetus 1B at 17 weeks, because they're actually made from MRI scans of fetuses that have been frozen. Sorry, they're made of sliced fetuses that have been frozen and then scanned layer by layer and reassembled in virtual space. And so there's a very direct relation. This was a human to be turned into a 3D printed object. And this uses a form of 3D printing that has a soft layer, outer layer, and a hard inner layer. Other neat kind of DIY projects like a hand-wound headphones for your iPhone. And then, of course, we made some more blocks because, hey, we've got a printer again. And the toy version of this seemed really exciting and playful and interesting. And what it permitted people to do was, instead of having this imposed on them, you could interact with the units yourself and build things. So this is some simple hardware. This is a prototype from 2012 of the next generation of marching cubes, or marching cubes made physical, as I call this group of work. And we started building more and more stuff. And then I changed jobs again, and I lost my MakerBot because it had to stay behind. And so it sort of sat in this state for a number of years. This is enough units to fill a 3 by 3 by 3 voxel space. And the question that remained at the end of this sort of prototype was, well, if I had a few thousand of these, what could I go on and make, and how would people interact with them? But there's a problem. The problem is that this hardware is really annoying. These are little pins, and putting the pins together, I sort of stopped here also because this wasn't the right way to connect these things. It didn't have Lego's kind of affordances and Lego's ease of use. I mean, at some point, if you're asking people to interact with something, there has to be a kind of intuitiveness and ease, otherwise it's not any fun. The other piece of the puzzle that was needed is, if you want to make something specific, if you want to take your coffee cup and scan it, and then reduce it to a set of units and build it, maybe you can figure that out on your own, but wouldn't it be nice to have Lego-like instructions? And so the algorithm naturally feeds you can use the computer to create those instructions, which Luke is actually working on in Vancouver for an exhibition next year, which is my last set of slides. I finally have a prototype, which I brought for you today, of a kind of playful and a reasonably playful way of connecting marching cubes units. So I'll pass this around. They're magnetized, they're a bit sharp. I made the mistake of throwing this at Garnet, and I won't do that again because it's very sharp. But if you pop this is only the two smallest units, and this is basically the smallest possible marching cubes assembly, and it does, okay, no, apparently it's sort of prototype. Don't pull that piece up. Well, if it breaks, it'll go back together. The magnets they're spherical magnets that rotate in a kind of captured space, and that allows them to, their polarities to come together in the correct way. And so right now, I made this actually last week, and this is all I've got. I have some bigger pieces, but I've also stopped again because on my particular 3D printer, the big piece takes 12 hours and costs $30. So and I want to make a few thousand of them. So I'm going to make another prototype at Yay scale and then move on to regular injection molding, which is how Lego is made, but that will require outside help. And this will be installed at UC Irvine. We have a place called the Experimental Media Performance Lab. So it's a black blocked gallery that has projection and the ability to communicate with other spaces. People will be invited to come into the space and build either what's on the screen, the instructions are being projected to them, or if they want, they can be renegade LEGO users and just build whatever they want. So maybe they'll have a fight. And in fact, the installation will be set up so that different forms of interaction are being tested. And then I'm going to move it to my gallery in Toronto, where we'll have a kind of static installation somehow in this very small floor area. And the question of what is going to be made remains open. So one of the things that I'll be able to send to you in a couple of months is an invitation to sort of, hey, I want you to make, I hope it's not a coffee cup, that's kind of boring, but I want you to make this thing. And then within the 6-week span of the installation, you know, the people that have been the actors and volunteers will build that thing for you. I'm hoping that we'll have to test how long it takes to build one thing, but the idea is to build as many things as we have time for. And I would like to conclude by bringing this back to Wright. Wright's whole fixation on geometric space can be attributed, at least in part, to his childhood exposure to what are called the Froebel gifts. And the Froebel gifts was from the 1850s. Dr. Froebel thought that children's sort of creativity should be encouraged by a series of gifts, and the first 5 gifts are all geometric pieces, and gift number 3 is a set of perfect cubes. And then there's perfect triangles and spheres and these sorts of things. And Wright would often speak of how the maple blocks in his hands were the thing that drove everything he did in his life. It's an interesting, you still buy these, it's still a kind of Montessori school type educational tool. They're not, but they've been around since the 1850s. And that's it. Thank you. If the little magnets fall out, just stick them to another magnet. They're very sticky that way.
So questions for Jesse.
When will we? When will we be able to buy these toys?
Well, one of the things I don't know, and one of the questions for me as an artist, because I sometimes operate as a designer and sometimes operate as an artist, primarily operate as an artist now, I have to kind of shift modes back into a more designerly and entrepreneurial space, and I'm interested in that, and I'm actually interested in how those conversations are very different. So I'm totally open to making a toy. The truth is, construction toys is not an easy market. There's lots of really great construction toys that never made it because Lego just dominates the market. It's like the QWERTY keyboard dominates the keyboard world because it was the first one. And it's not the best keyboard, it's actually a terrible keyboard, but we're never going to change it because nobody wants to learn. So there's a resistance to, and this is a fairly well established, you go and look at construction toys. So I'm going to pursue it, but it's not my primary goal.
Because it would be really good if we can have these toys in the classroom to teach modeling.
Well, and this is a good point. I mean, the idea of it being a teaching tool specifically for teaching modeling, for teaching this algorithm makes a lot of sense. So maybe you point to a smaller market. I'm not thinking of. Email me and I will let you know. Yes?
Is there also kind of an angle for like prototyping, like using it to prototype rather than as a teaching?
You could. It's not. You definitely could. It has limits. It has this resolution. One thing I can't demonstrate with this small number of pieces is there's a very strong resolution limit. I mean, there's only 45s and 90s, and so if you take a smooth thing, and like if you wanted to make a sphere, the sphere becomes like an it's not as smooth as a soccer ball. It's like quite non-smooth. So for most modeling purposes, it's probably not the best tool, but for like quickly assembling a volume, one thing that it could be used for sculpturally is if you want to see how a sculpture occupies space in advance of making it, like you could really get a sense for how you could adjust, because sculptors are very concerned with how an object occupies the space that it's in, and it's kind of a way, and I think that's one of my interests too, is like in making this thing in space, you end up with these different relationships to the space. It can make anything within it, but it will always be a kind of faceted version of that thing, and obviously potentially bright orange and blue. They may not be bright orange and blue, those are the colors I had. Other questions?
I have a kind of boring modeling question for you. When you're doing the 3D side of this, are you using algorithmic modeling? So are you running this through Grasshopper to make the pieces, or are you doing them manually?
Not currently, although, so when the first version project from 2009, Grasshopper didn't exist yet.
Okay.
So it is the obvious tool to sort of populate. And when I went back to it, because I already have the pieces modeled, there's no, I mean, it's a short answer is sort of. The instructions will use scripts in Rhino to populate,
Okay.
and it'll be like Grasshopper, but you won't see the interface.
Okay.
There's a like from a truly boring part of the answer is there's one thing that Grasshopper can't do that doesn't allow it to populate space. It's like missing. We would need to script. I forget what they're called. I've used Grasshopper a couple years. The little box thing you plug into Grasshopper. Grasshopper is a program for a modeling protocol software called Rhino that allows you to write instructions, it allows you to graphically make instructions for how to make geometry, rather than, so if you want to change something, you just like change the slider and the object changes. So it is the perfect kind of tool for this. But it just turns out to not have all the right components. They're called the little components, or the things in the graphical interface that you plug together. I'll get more one if I go on. Yes?
What inspired the magnets? That's a really clever solution.
We spent a lot of time trying to solve the geometric problem of having things that come together that both translate and rotate. And because they rotate, you can take two of the pieces can come together and then also spin around and come together, and that precludes any kind of mechanical hardware or just a plain magnet. And I guess it just occurred to me one day that a spherical magnet that could rotate inside its space would solve that problem. And I had been avoiding doing it because they're expensive, but I finally discovered that if I go on Alibaba, I can order from China. Those magnets are $4 each at Home Depot, and they're like $2 each from Specialty Supplier, and they're 5 cents each in quantities of 10,000. But I need 25,000, so that works out really well. But I had this, in some ways, like that's a technological advancement that didn't exist. You could have gone and ordered these from China in 2009, but the sort of like artist accessible mechanism for doing that wasn't available. So the world has changed enough to make that possible, which is exciting.
I'm wondering, could you speak a little bit more to, I mean, it's pretty clear to me, and I would assume most people in this room, that you're doing interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary work, but this often gets talked of in the academy around the methods, and I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to like this in the exhibition or installation context. So where this material is installed, and maybe like who the audiences are, who you work with. So like who convenes around this sort of work? Are they mainly architects, mainly designers, sculpture? I mean, where?
Well, it's a good question on every front. Every version of this body of work has been challenged by one of those audiences as being like not the right way to do things.
Okay.
So when I was, and because my own identity has shifted over the course of the project, from a fairly, I was being trained as an architect when the project started. And so the interest in Wright at that moment, despite very much being installation, I mean, our architects have seen installations like that's a nice vehicle for showing an idea, particularly because architects make things and are interested in physical space. But at the time, if I was to, it wasn't like I wasn't conceiving of it at the time as a kind of fine artist making installation art, and the language around installation art is different than the sort of architectural demonstration. But people were like, why would you recreate an existing building? Like it becomes a kind of art question at that moment, because architects are fixated on authorship of a particular type, and they don't want to make existing buildings. In some ways, Wright's problem was he made a custom system that no architect would ever adopt because it wasn't theirs. And so then we sort of shifted into a more kind of art installation art conversation. But then when it comes to building things, then I would get challenged by there's a post-studio tendency in some parts of the art world. It's like, well, why are you making those yourself? Why are you bothering to CNC machine? And in every front, I mean, I do tend to throw up my hands and say it's because I want to, because I like making things. I can theorize more, I probably wax poetic more eloquently about why making is important, but the truth is it's just like important to me. That's part of my makeup is wanting to make things. I'm a little bit disappointed to not be able to make, this will have 2,500 parts and 24,000 magnets, and like, I just can't. My lab, they'll be so much better if they're made
Yeah.
in an injection molding facility. So I'm willing to let go. But this is actually the first moment where I haven't wanted to make it myself. I mean, that's sort of not a total answer to your question, and I'm not, I mean, that's one of the, my interdisciplinarity is kind of by happenstance, and it's not theoretically driven. It's not like I'm gonna go work this discipline out. It's like, this is just the right way to make this thing that I wanna make. If anything, I'm still an architect because the maniacal desire to execute is still present in every step.
Cool.
But I'm very interested in the conversations about making that take place outside of the Fine Art Academy for this reason, because I do think it's a chance to reflect on the nature of making in a way that's new and also sort of responds to contemporary technology in a way that maybe the art conversation hasn't. I mean, I'm making a lab like a little bit like Gentry's, where we're trying to capture the interest of people in humanities, or like as the art counterpart, and getting, resistance and people like, why is that an interesting conversation? It's like, well, it just, students want to learn to make, the technology's transformative, and there's an opportunity to have a conversation about the nature of making in the 21st century that's very different than it was historically.
Things fall apart.
So how do you first get to know this learning cubes algorithm? Like did
We
you-
had taken a computer science class, so I was an engineer originally, so I literally came across it I hadn't learned that algorithm specifically, but that the existence of these procedural, these procedures was known to both Luke and
in undergrad?
I. In undergrad, I,
In Toronto.
in Vancouver, I went to UBC to be a civil engineer. So,
Yeah, because it pretty, like, people usually don't do artwork stuff on computer always, on computer science.
well, there's a whole world of sort of generative artwork and algorithmic work, and Gentry was just saying there's a famous media theorist, Lev Manovich, who just said apparently, like, you guys don't understand algorithms, like, stop talking about them. And it's an interesting problem because the world of people interested in talking about algorithm as a way of making art do tend to be far less skilled at creating and manipulating algorithms than people in computer science. But our world is set up disciplinarily, and it's very difficult to I like to bring this talk to computer science departments because this is so weird. Because this is just for you guys, it's a procedure that's like a seminal historical way of modeling, and that's the value of this cross-pollination, is that it's never really occurred to you guys to turn into art, and it's never occurred to artists to turn to you for ideas. But it's just kind of dumb luck that I happen to know one thing and happen to know that thing, and can glue them together. And that's become the way that I tend to work.